The sky over Indiana hung low, heavy with the weight of unfallen snow. Below it, Mercer's yard sat silent, an expansive grid of rusting metal and forgotten machines. For 30 years, this plot of land had absorbed the grease and sweat of a generation. Now, a 90-day foreclosure notice fluttered against the cold chain-link fence. Beneath the chassis of a fractured 2005 Freightliner, a man moved with methodical precision. Ethan Mercer tightened a worn bolt, the cold steel unforgiving against his scarred knuckles. He was 35, built by the relentless demands of mechanical labor. His blue-gray eyes tracked the alignment of the suspension, analyzing the machine's geometry without a single wasted motion. The sharp crunch of tires on frozen gravel broke the mechanical rhythm. A pristine black SUV halted at the edge of the yard, an alien artifact in this weathered landscape. The driver's door opened, cutting through the chilling wind. Victoria Vance stepped out onto the fractured asphalt, the sleek lines of her trench coat rejecting the industrial decay around her. She surveyed the rusted containers with an expression of sterile calculation. As the CEO of Vance Logistics, she evaluated the world exclusively through the lens of leverage and margin. Ethan slid out from beneath the truck. He stood slowly, wiping dark grease from his jawline, his presence dominating the physical space yet completely devoid of unnecessary words. Victoria approached him, her golden hair catching the dull winter light. Her gaze locked onto him, carrying the crushing weight of a corporate entity accustomed to absolute surrender. "This location is financially unviable, Mr. Mercer," she stated, her tone devoid of malice or empathy. "Sign the transfer before the bank erases what little equity remains." The corporate ultimatum hung in the freezing air. Ethan glanced at the embossed business card resting on the rusted hood of the Freightliner. He did not reach for it. Instead, his calloused hand closed around the heavy steel wrench abandoned on the frozen gravel. Without a single syllable of defense or negotiation, he turned his back on the CEO and walked back toward the mechanical carcass. Victoria Vance watched his retreating figure. For a fraction of a second, the sterile predictability of her corporate algorithm was interrupted. She offered no further warnings. The heavy door of the black SUV sealed her back into her temperature-controlled environment. The vehicle's tail lights faded down the access road, leaving the junkyard to the encroaching shadows of the winter evening. As night fully claimed the Indiana landscape, the temperature plummeted. The perimeter of Mercer's yard dissolved into pitch blackness. Inside the leaning wooden structure that served as an office, a solitary yellow bulb fractured the darkness. Ethan sat at a scarred wooden desk. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sharp scrape of a pencil against paper. He was not drafting a plea to the bank. His scarred fingers sketched load calculations and spatial grids, mapping a new logistical node. Dawn broke over the rusted perimeter of Mercer's yard. The freezing temperature held the industrial wreckage in a state of suspended animation, indifferent to human ambition. Survival required capital. Ethan Mercer approached his personal vehicle, a reliable but aging sedan, devoid of sentimentality. It was no longer a possession, it was leverage. In a sterile transaction under the gray morning sky, a local dealer handed over a modest stack of bills. Ethan surrendered the keys without a backward glance. The capital was immediately converted into mechanical assets. High-tensile steel, heavy-duty winch cables, and a specialized auxiliary transmission unit were procured with calculated efficiency. Back at the yard, the components were unloaded onto the frozen asphalt. Each part was categorized and arranged according to the strict logistical grid he had drafted. Ethan donned his heavy welding mask. The rusted chassis of the 2005 Freightliner awaited its surgical reconstruction, a dormant beast ready for mechanical resurrection. A brilliant arc of blue-white plasma shattered the winter gloom. Sparks rained down onto the ice as Ethan welded the reinforced steel winch mount to the frame. He operated the heavy machinery with brutal precision. His muscles strained against the weight of the auxiliary transmission, guiding it into the belly of the truck. Hours bled into the fading afternoon. The rhythmic clanging of hammers and the hiss of pneumatic tools echoed across the desolate landscape, forging a new reality. As dusk approached, the freightliner was no longer a decaying carcass. It stood fortified, transformed into a heavy-duty recovery vehicle, waiting for the first crisis. The rebuilt freightliner was not merely a vehicle, it was the primary tool for the yard's physical expansion. The deep idle of its engine vibrated through the frozen ground. Ethan utilized the immense torque of the machine. Heavy steel chains were secured to decades of rusted scrap, dragging the industrial debris away from the main perimeter. The chaotic graveyard of metal was systematically cleared. What emerged was a vast, level expanse of hard-packed gravel and asphalt, exactly as charted in his leather notebook. Precision replaced decay. Pushing a mechanical striping machine, Ethan walked the cleared lot, laying down stark white lines over the dark, icy surface. The grid was calculated for maximum capacity. Each marked space was designed to accommodate a fully loaded commercial transport vehicle, converting empty land into a logistical asset. He then turned his focus to the 3 structural steel shipping containers resting at the back of the property. They were intact but heavily weathered by years of neglect. A high-pressure industrial washer blasted away layers of grime and frozen dirt. The raw, imposing steel of the containers was exposed, sterile and functional. New heavy-duty locking mechanisms were bolted onto the heavy doors. The discarded boxes were now secure, short-term freight storage units, filling a critical gap in the supply chain. With the physical infrastructure established, Ethan walked back to the entrance gate. The bank's 90-day notice still fluttered against the cold metal mesh. He tore the legal document down, crushing the crisp paper in his calloused fist. The deadline was no longer an execution date, it was simply a production schedule. Rumors of the yard's operational status propagated along the interstate corridor. The rigid lines of the newly painted lot signaled a disruption in the local logistical ecosystem. Commercial drivers passing mile marker 41 observed the secure containers and the fortified recovery vehicle. The abandoned junkyard was now functioning as an unauthorized transit node. 30 miles away, inside the sterile glass walls of the Vance Logistics boardroom, this anomalous activity was quantified. The corporate organism recognized an unregulated variable. An executive directive was silently issued. It was not a physical confrontation, but a calculated financial squeeze designed to sever Mercer's supply lines before winter peaked. The effect was immediate. By noon the next day, a commercial supply truck halted outside the frozen gates of Mercer's yard without cutting its engine. The delivery driver handed Ethan a clipboard. A heavy red stamp marked the critical generator components as indefinitely suspended due to sudden corporate vendor restrictions. Ethan absorbed the information without a shift in his heart rate. His blue-gray eyes scanned the voided manifest, analyzing the blockade not as an attack, but as a systemic fault. The supply truck reversed onto the access road, taking the essential hardware with it. The yard remained silent under the overcast Indiana sky. Ethan walked back to the partially dismantled diesel generators. Without replacement parts, the property would freeze completely during the imminent seasonal grid failures. He reopened the scarred leather notebook. The corporate blockade required a mechanical bypass. His scarred fingers began drafting a secondary, localized procurement route. The corporate embargo was a mathematical problem, and Ethan Mercer solved it by removing currency from the equation. He targeted the independent mechanical network. The freightliner departed the yard, navigating the icy backroads of the county. He sought out the forgotten, off-the-grid workshops. At a rural machine shed, he located the exact auxiliary alternators required. The inventory belonged to an aging, independent machinist. No corporate funds were transferred. Ethan offered a direct barter, a fully rebuilt commercial transmission unit in exchange for the generator components. The transaction was finalized with a firm, grease-stained handshake. It was an economy built on tangible utility, completely invisible to Vance Logistics. The heavy alternators were secured onto the flatbed. The cold air bit at exposed skin, but the logistical gap was successfully bridged. Returning to the yard, the temperature dropped precipitously. The sky bruised a deep purple, signaling the arrival of a major winter front. Ethan immediately initiated the installation. He hoisted the heavy alternators into the rusted bellies of the dismantled diesel generators. Tools moved in a blur of calculated efficiency. Connections were bolted, wiring harnesses spliced, and fuel lines bled. With a heavy mechanical throw of the main breaker, the generators violently roared to life. A grid of industrial floodlights pierced the encroaching darkness. Mercer's yard now stood as an isolated fortress of light against the descending winter matrix. The diesel generators thrummed with a steady, defiant heartbeat. Inside the drafty wooden office, the temperature remained low, but the infrastructure was active. Ethan maintained an analog landline, immune to cellular grid failures. At 10:45, the mechanical bell of the heavy black phone shattered the silence. It was the first true test of the logistical node. The voice on the line belonged to an independent freight hauler. His transmission had seized on the icy shoulder of Interstate 70, miles from conventional assistance. Ethan recorded the exact mile marker with rigid precision. He did not offer reassurances, he only confirmed the ETA and severed the connection. The fortified freightliner breached the perimeter of the yard. Its heavy tires carved through the accumulating snow, moving against the flow of retreating traffic. The stranded commercial vehicle sat dead on the highway shoulder. Its hazard lights pulsed weakly, fighting a losing battle against the zero-visibility blizzard. The rescue rig arrived like a mechanical predator. Ethan stepped out into the sub-zero wind, evaluating the environment before acknowledging the stranded driver. He cracked the frozen hood of the stalled truck. The diagnosis was instantaneous: a sheared drive gear, impossible to repair in the field. Without wasting syllables, Ethan unspooled the heavy-duty winch cables. The first commercial recovery of Mercer Logistics had officially commenced. The winch cables tightened. The massive weight of the dead truck resisted, wheels locked by the sheer mechanical failure and accumulating ice. Ethan engaged the auxiliary transmission. The Freightliner's tires bit into the frozen asphalt, struggling for traction before finding the necessary grip. Slowly, the dead weight yielded. The two machines began a slow, perilous crawl back toward the illuminated sanctuary of the yard. The convoy arrived just as the blizzard reached its peak intensity. The gates of Mercer Logistics offered the only refuge within a 30-mile radius. Once secured inside the perimeter, the independent driver stepped down from his freezing cab. He was exhausted, his livelihood entirely dependent on the intact cargo he hauled. Ethan did not offer warm platitudes. He handed the driver a standardized invoice under the harsh glow of the exterior floodlights. The transaction was strictly professional. The driver handed over a stack of crisp bills, fully recognizing the value of a service rendered at midnight in a storm. Ethan folded the cash into his pocket without counting it. It was not merely income, it was the first definitive proof of concept for his logistical model. The driver retreated to the heated retrofitted container. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to the yard, methodically securing the broken truck for morning repairs. By sunrise, the independent driver would broadcast the event across the regional radio network. The silent yard was about to experience an exponential surge in demand. The morning sun illuminated the frozen interstate. Invisible radio waves carried the independent driver's transmission, propagating the success of Mercer Logistics across the regional network. Inside isolated commercial cabs, drivers absorbed the information. The existence of a secure, operational node in the middle of the winter corridor altered their logistical calculus. At a crowded highway diner, coordinates were exchanged over black coffee. The word-of-mouth economy functioned with greater efficiency than any corporate marketing algorithm. The effect was exponential. By midday, a line of heavy commercial vehicles idled steadily on the access road, waiting to enter the formerly abandoned property. Ethan Mercer pushed the heavy chain-link gates entirely open. The yard was officially absorbing the overflow of a fractured, overburdened regional supply chain. Massive trucks maneuvered into the rigidly painted grid. The spatial planning drafted in the cold office proved mathematically flawless, maximizing every square foot of asphalt. The retrofitted shipping containers were unlocked. Short-term freight transfers commenced directly on the frozen ground, entirely bypassing traditional, overpriced corporate warehousing structures. Ethan moved between the mechanical giants with calm authority. He inspected engines, directed traffic, and collected standardized payments without a trace of fatigue. Inside the drafty wooden office, the financial ledger reflected the surge. The numbers in the right column steadily eclipsed the bank's crushing 90-day foreclosure threshold. However, the sudden redirection of capital left a digital footprint. In the sterile towers of Vance Logistics, a sharp drop in regional service revenue triggered automated alarms. The financial anomaly was immediately elevated to the executive level. A stark red line on the boardroom monitor indicated a critical loss of regional market share. Victoria Vance observed the data in absolute silence. Her initial assessment of the Junkyard's demise had been mathematically disproven. The senior executive attempted to rationalize the failure of his supply blockade. Victoria stopped his explanation with a single, calculating glance. She pulled up real-time logistical reports. Mercer's yard was not merely surviving, it was systematically absorbing Vance Logistics' overflow traffic. Simultaneously, the infrastructure of Mercer Logistics expanded. Marcus, the independent machinist, arrived at the yard as the sun set. Ethan handed the older man a set of heavy brass keys. The transfer of responsibility was wordless, establishing a permanent night shift operation. Marcus assumed control of the dispatch board. The yard's operational capacity officially transitioned to a continuous 24-hour cycle. For the first time since inheriting the property, Ethan paused. He observed the relentless, mechanical rhythm of the empire he had constructed from scrap. A bank envelope rested on the desk. Beside it lay a certified cashier's check, fully neutralizing the foreclosure threat well ahead of the deadline. The corporate equation had permanently changed. Victoria Vance stepped out of her headquarters, recognizing that a direct renegotiation with Ethan Mercer was now mandatory. The glossy black SUV returned down the access road. However, the terrain had fundamentally transformed. The icy dirt was now heavy-grade asphalt, supporting a steady flow of commercial traffic. Victoria Vance stepped out into the crisp winter air. The rusted graveyard she had previously evaluated had been entirely overwritten by a symphony of mechanical order. At the front gates, Marcus operated a highly efficient dispatch point, logging inbound and outbound heavy freight with a headset and a digital tablet. Victoria's sharp eyes calculated the volume. She observed the interconnected, freshly painted shipping containers and the towering, newly erected signage of Mercer Logistics. She located Ethan Mercer. He was no longer confined beneath the chassis of a broken machine. He stood in the center of the yard, a silent architect overseeing his creation. Victoria approached him with measured steps. The power dynamic of their previous encounter had been entirely neutralized by undeniable logistical success. "I miscalculated the potential of this location," she stated cleanly. There was no apology in her tone, only the pragmatic admission of a factual error. Ethan did not offer a victorious smile. He took a slow sip of black coffee from a ceramic mug, his expression remaining perfectly impenetrable. Without further preamble, Victoria unlocked a sleek leather briefcase. The corporate organism had adapted its strategy from suppression to acquisition. She withdrew a heavily bound, formal document. It was a multi-million-dollar buyout proposal, offering Ethan massive capital in exchange for total surrender of the property. Ethan accepted the heavy binding. He set his coffee aside and rested the corporate proposal on the flat, rusted hood of an old flatbed truck. The pages contained a meticulously structured acquisition figure, $1.2 million. A sum designed to overwhelm any independent operator into immediate submission. Victoria observed him with intense focus. She anticipated the standard physiological reactions to sudden corporate wealth: widened eyes, elevated breathing, a shift in posture. Ethan's heart rate did not elevate. He analyzed the proposal with the exact same objective scrutiny he applied to diagnosing a fractured transmission block. He closed the heavy leather cover with a solid thud. Without a moment of hesitation, he slid the document back across the icy metal toward her. A single payout surrenders a producing asset, Ethan stated flatly. In 3 years, this yard clears that number autonomously. Selling is mathematically illogical. Victoria was momentarily silenced. The rejection was not fueled by ego or territorial sentimentality, but by pure, unassailable financial architecture. Ethan reached into the deep inner pocket of his heavy winter coat. He did not extract a counter-proposal drafted by legal counsel. He withdrew a folded piece of spiral notebook paper. He smoothed the wrinkled, grease-stained sheet flat onto the cold truck hood between them. Vance Logistics redirects all regional service here. A 60-40 revenue split. No equity transfer, he dictated cleanly. I maintain absolute control. Victoria looked down at the handwritten terms. The contrast between her multi-million-dollar legal binder and his grease-stained notebook paper was absolute. She read the terms twice. There was no hidden legal phrasing, no corporate trapdoors, just pure, distilled operational mechanics. In corporate boardrooms, she would typically deploy financial leverage to fracture such rigid demands. But leverage required vulnerability. Ethan Mercer possessed no vulnerability. He controlled the sole operational recovery hub on a heavily trafficked, unforgiving interstate corridor. She recognized the absolute efficiency of his model. It was not built on speculative market data, but on dirt, steel, and relentless execution. I will have the legal department formalize these parameters, Victoria stated, her voice completely devoid of corporate ego. She withdrew a polished silver pen from the inner pocket of her tailored trench coat, leaning over the rusted flatbed hood. With a sharp, fluid motion, she signed her name at the bottom of the lined notebook paper, establishing an official letter of intent. Victoria extended her hand. Ethan gripped it. The handshake was brief, firm, and entirely devoid of sentimentality. She turned and walked back to her vehicle. The corporate acquisition had failed, but an immensely profitable partnership had just been forged. 8 months progressed. The seasonal freeze thawed, revealing a fully realized logistical hub operating at peak mechanical efficiency. The steady rhythm of commercial freight was suddenly interrupted. A rented, brightly colored sports car aggressively navigated the access road, entirely out of place. Jason Mercer stepped out of the vehicle. Dressed in a sharply tailored designer jacket, his eyes rapidly assessed the sheer volume of profitable infrastructure before him. He had formally abandoned the property when it was suffocating in debt. Now, he walked into the dispatch office with the unearned ease of a returning proprietor. Jason initiated his pitch. He framed his return not as a corporate cash grab, but as a family partnership, casually requesting a 30% equity stake in the operation. Ethan did not interrupt the monologue. He remained seated at his desk, his blue-gray eyes focused primarily on a stack of mechanical maintenance logs. When the performance concluded, Ethan stood up in silence. He opened a heavy steel filing cabinet and retrieved a single, legally binding document. It was the formal waiver of inheritance rights. The paper bore Jason's own signature, relinquishing all claims to the yard during its period of financial decay. You wrote your own exit, Ethan stated flatly, placing the signed waiver on the desk. I do not revise history to accommodate regret. The superficial charm instantly evaporated from Jason's face. He turned and exited the office, the rejection calcifying into a calculated, silent resentment. 2 weeks later, an invisible threat began to circulate through the regional trucking networks. The physical yard was untouched, but its digital reputation was under covert assault. On independent driver forums, anonymous posts appeared in rapid succession. They questioned the operational legality of Mercer logistics, citing fabricated permit violations and unregistered recovery vehicles. The interference was precise and calculated. Regional corporate carriers received anonymous phone calls warning them against utilizing the hub, threatening their own compliance records. The operational impact was immediately quantifiable. Incoming service calls dropped by 30% in a single week. The yard experienced sudden, unnatural intervals of absolute silence. Inside the dispatch office, Marcus reviewed the declining schedule board. The visual data was stark. 2 short-term container tenants had already requested immediate contract terminations. Ethan did not react with anger. He sat at the dispatch terminal, approaching the targeted misinformation campaign as a mechanical fault requiring precise diagnosis. He analyzed the digital timestamps of the anonymous posts. The cadence, phrasing, and posting times perfectly aligned with the timeline of his brother's rejected proposal. The correlation was mathematically absolute. Ethan printed the digital server logs, generating the physical evidence of Jason's covert interference. Without hesitation, Ethan picked up the heavy black analog phone. He dialed a sequence of numbers he had not contacted in years. The line connected. Ethan did not raise his voice. He delivered a flat, legally binding ultimatum, preparing to sever the biological connection permanently if the interference continued. Ethan severed the connection. The external threat was neutralized, but the reputational damage required immediate, mechanical repair. He returned to the steel filing cabinet, extracting a thick, heavy folder containing the yard's active operational permits and commercial insurance certificates. Utilizing a high-resolution scanner, Ethan digitized every legal document. He was preparing a transparent data packet, designed to completely dismantle the fabricated narrative. He did not rely on passive digital communication. He picked up the phone and personally dialed the operations managers of the carriers who had been misled. Across the region, corporate managers received the calls. Ethan's voice was direct, factual, and completely transparent, offering raw data in place of defensive arguments. He transmitted the data packets instantly. The managers reviewed the valid, active permits on their screens, immediately verifying the absolute legitimacy of Mercer Logistics. The independent drivers were contacted next. Ethan utilized the primary radio frequency, broadcasting his commercial registration numbers directly into the cabs of passing trucks. The misinformation campaign fundamentally collapsed. The fabricated digital rumors could not withstand the undeniable weight of physical, verifiable evidence. The result was a total operational reversal. The carriers who were initially targeted now viewed Mercer Logistics as the most reliable, structurally sound partner in the region. Within 48 hours, the dispatch schedule achieved total saturation. Marcus methodically secured new pins into the corkboard, as the yard returned to maximum capacity. The National Weather Service issued an emergency broadcast. A historic, massive low-pressure system was rapidly descending directly onto the interstate corridor. The sky over Indiana transformed into a violent, bruised gray. The ambient temperature plummeted to critical levels, freezing the asphalt into a solid sheet of black ice. Major commercial carriers immediately began routing their fleets off the road, seeking any available harbor. But the flow of critical logistics could not entirely stop. Ethan Mercer did not retreat. He treated the impending natural event as the ultimate stress test for his infrastructure, initiating rapid survival protocols. He and Marcus moved methodically. They topped off the primary and auxiliary diesel generators with heavy winter-grade fuel, guaranteeing uninterrupted electrical power. Marcus inspected the reinforced locking mechanisms and structural integrity of the shipping containers, ensuring they could withstand hurricane-force winter winds. Heavy industrial portable heaters were ignited inside the steel structures. The freight units were temporarily repurposed as emergency thermal shelters for stranded drivers. Inside the drafty dispatch office, Marcus calibrated the communication console. The radio frequencies crackled with the first desperate signs of highway chaos. Ethan equipped himself in heavily insulated winter gear. He mounted the rebuilt Freightliner, checking the tension on the massive steel winch cables one final time. The first wave of the blizzard struck. A solid wall of blinding white snow slammed into the yard, reducing visibility to zero. Mercer Logistics was officially under siege by the elements. The blizzard obliterated the physical landscape. Inside the dispatch office, Marcus managed a relentless flood of distress signals echoing over the crackling radio frequencies. Ethan piloted the Freightliner directly into the blinding whiteout. The massive recovery machine crushed through accumulating snowdrifts, a mechanical predator hunting in the dark. At mile marker 44, a commercial transport was violently jackknifed into the icy median, completely paralyzed by the zero-degree elements. Ethan arrived and stepped into the sub-zero wind. Without a single wasted motion, he secured the heavy steel winch chains to the paralyzed vehicle's front axle. The Freightliner's engine roared with immense torque. Heavy tires spun, then viciously bit the ice, forcefully extracting the massive transport from the snowbank. The rescue operation was highly systematic. Over the next 3 hours, Ethan executed 4 separate high-risk commercial recoveries in zero-visibility conditions. Back at the yard, the industrial floodlights cut defiantly through the storm. Marcus guided the recovered convoy of heavy trucks safely into the organized grid. The rescued drivers stepped out of their freezing cabs, physically exhausted. They were immediately directed toward the retrofitted, illuminated shipping containers. Inside the steel walls, industrial heaters emitted a powerful, life-saving orange glow. The drivers sat in silence, surviving the lethal drop in ambient temperature. Ethan did not rest. Covered in frost, he refueled his rig, took a single sip of cold coffee, and turned back toward the deadly whiteout. At 1:30 in the morning, the dedicated radio frequency assigned to Vance Logistics initiated a distress sequence. Marcus logged the coordinates. A specialized corporate convoy consisting of 5 Class 8 tractors hauling time-sensitive equipment was pinned against the eastern median. Ethan received the transmission while actively navigating the frozen highway. He shifted the heavy transmission, immediately adjusting his trajectory eastward into the whiteout. The Vance Logistics convoy was entirely paralyzed. Wind-driven snow rapidly accumulated against the sleek corporate branding of the paralyzed vehicles. The heavy headlights of the Mercer recovery rig pierced the darkness. Ethan's mechanical beast confronted the pristine but immobilized corporate fleet. Ethan stepped into the hurricane-force winds. He bypassed any verbal communication with the stranded lead driver, immediately dragging the heavy winch cables toward the first truck. The physical exertion was immense. Ethan secured the thick steel hooks to the frozen undercarriage, locking the extraction mechanism into place. He executed the same brutal, mechanical extraction 5 consecutive times. Each corporate tractor was forcefully pulled from the icy grip of the median. By 3:30 in the morning, the entire multi-million-dollar corporate convoy rolled safely through the illuminated gates of Mercer's yard. The Vance lead driver stood in the snow, utilizing a satellite phone to report the successful extraction to his corporate dispatcher. The logistical node had performed flawlessly. The morning sun broke through the dissipating storm clouds. Mercer's yard stood immaculate and fully operational amidst the frozen devastation of the surrounding county. The 5 corporate Vance tractors sat safely within the perimeter, their cargo completely intact. Ethan's mechanical intervention had saved millions in corporate assets. Inside the dispatch office, Marcus processed the unprecedented surge of incoming traffic. The regional supply chain was entirely rerouting through their coordinates. Ethan stood on the freshly cleared asphalt, his heavy coat covered in melting frost. He observed the relentless, ordered movement of heavy machinery with absolute stoicism. 30 miles away, the Vance Logistics boardroom was uncharacteristically silent. The executive team reviewed the survival report of their multi-million-dollar convoy. The financial calculus was undeniable. The independent junkyard operator they had attempted to crush had become their primary structural safeguard. Victoria Vance stood by the glass window, looking out over the snow-covered city. Her pragmatic mind completely accepted the new hierarchical reality. Back at the yard, heavy commercial drivers shook Ethan's calloused hand. There were no elaborate ceremonies, only the deep, silent respect of men who understood the road. The rusted sign of the original junkyard had been entirely replaced. Mercer Logistics was no longer a desperate gamble, it was an impenetrable, undeniable empire. The transition from survival to overwhelming profitability altered the yard's structure, but not its architect. Ethan Mercer's wealth accumulated silently in digital accounts. He did not purchase luxury vehicles or designer attire. The corporate capital was aggressively reinvested into heavy mechanical infrastructure. A second operational bay was constructed, featuring specialized hydraulic lifts designed exclusively for heavy commercial recovery. 2 additional heavy-duty rescue rigs were acquired and methodically retrofitted. The Mercer fleet expanded, securing absolute dominance over the regional logistical corridor. Inside the newly modernized dispatch center, Marcus operated advanced dual-screen monitors. The analog systems were replaced by seamless, efficient digital tracking software. The mail carrier arrived at the yard. Among the standardized corporate invoices was a thick, handwritten envelope addressed specifically to Ethan. Ethan recognized the erratic handwriting instantly. The return address indicated a transient location belonging to his brother, Jason. The psychological trap was obvious, a desperate plea for financial intervention disguised as familial reconciliation. Ethan held the sealed envelope. He did not open it. He approached the massive industrial propane heater roaring in the corner of the dispatch center. With a steady, unbothered motion, he dropped the unopened letter into the open flame. The paper curled, blackened, and disintegrated into silent ash. Winter yielded to early spring, revealing the structural damage left by the historic storm. A critical overpass on Interstate 70 suffered a catastrophic structural failure. The State Transportation Authority immediately severed the primary commercial artery. Hundreds of heavy freight carriers were abruptly stranded without a viable detour. Traditional logistics algorithms collapsed under the sudden geographical constraint. Only one independent node possessed the geographical positioning to bypass the failure. Mercer Logistics received the state mandate. Ethan stood in the dispatch center, watching the digital map flood with red rerouting requests. He did not hesitate. He authorized the total absorption of the state's commercial overflow, pushing his operational capacity to its absolute limit. The access road transformed into an endless mechanical river. Trucks of every corporate affiliation merged into the meticulously structured grid of the yard. Marcus directed the fleet with the precision of an air traffic controller. The newly constructed hydraulic bays operated continuously, processing breakdowns in minutes. A corporate helicopter descended through the gray spring sky, landing on a secured perimeter pad. Victoria Vance had arrived to observe the phenomenon. She stepped onto the tarmac, the sheer magnitude of the operation silencing any remaining corporate skepticism. Ethan's empire was now sustaining the state economy. Ethan met her near the landing zone. The roaring engines of 100 commercial rigs drowned out the world, cementing his absolute dominance. The physical expansion of Mercer Logistics continued without interruption. The once abandoned 3 acres were now a heavily fortified, multi-million-dollar complex. The original rusted gates had been replaced by automated heavy steel barriers. Security infrastructure integrated seamlessly with the logistical flow. Marcus trained a new generation of dispatchers, transferring the rigid, methodical systems he and Ethan had developed during the winter. The Freightliner rescue rig, the catalyst of the entire operation, was retired from active service. It was parked cleanly near the entrance, a monument to the first winter. Advanced Logistics, Victoria maintained the financial partnership with cold efficiency. The flow of capital was guaranteed, secured by undeniably consistent operational metrics. Jason's transient existence faded from the narrative. The absolute rejection of his corporate manipulation proved fatal to any further attempts at contact. Inside the massive new workshop bay, Ethan Mercer stood beneath a suspended commercial chassis. The sheer wealth accumulated had not altered his physical location. He did not occupy a sterile corner office in a glass tower. His calloused hands still held the heavy steel wrenches that had built the empire. The roar of diesel engines, the hiss of air brakes, and the sharp crackle of welding torches formed a perpetual, unyielding mechanical symphony. The camera pulled back over the roaring interstate. Mercer Logistics stood as an indestructible node in the supply chain, a quiet empire built on grease, steel, and absolute execution.